10 years ago, I died in a plane crash. At least that's what everyone believed until last Tuesday when I was walking through Los Angeles International Airport, minding my own business, and a 6-year-old boy changed my entire world. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 32 years old. I live in Seattle, where I run a small but successful marketing consulting firm. I drive a reliable Honda Civic, I have a cat named Pixel, and my biggest worry on most days is whether I remembered to buy coffee filters. I'm the kind of person who color codes her calendar and actually enjoys doing taxes. My life is predictable, organized, and exactly how I like it. I was coming back from Los Angeles after closing a deal with a tech startup that could change everything for my business. I felt good, accomplished, like all those late nights and early mornings were finally paying off. The kind of tired satisfaction you get when hard work actually works out. I was already planning my celebration dinner, thinking maybe I'd splurge on that expensive sushi place near my apartment. The airport was typical LAX chaos. Families dragging oversized suitcases, business travelers glued to their phones, that constant hum of announcements and conversations in a dozen different languages. I was checking my phone for my Uber when I heard this little voice, scared and desperate, calling out for his mommy. That's when I saw him. This tiny boy with dark hair and the biggest brown eyes I've ever seen, standing in the middle of all these rushing people, like he was completely lost. He was maybe 6 years old, wearing a Spider-Man backpack that looked almost as big as he was, and he had that look kids get when they're trying really hard not to cry but failing. My heart broke a little. I've always been a sucker for kids in distress, even though I don't have any of my own. Something about their complete vulnerability just gets to me every time. So I walked over, thinking I'd help him find airport security, or maybe spot his parents in the crowd. But before I could say anything, this little boy looked up at me and his whole face lit up like Christmas morning. He ran straight to me, wrapped his arms around my legs, and said the words that would turn my entire life upside down. "Mommy, you're here. Daddy said you were coming back." I felt my heart skip, not from joy, but from confusion. I gently pulled back and knelt down to his level, giving him my warmest smile. "Sorry, buddy, I think you've got the wrong person. I'm not your mom. Are you lost? Let's find your daddy, okay?" But he shook his head with that stubborn certainty only children possess. "No, you're my mommy. Daddy showed me pictures. You have the same smile." Before I could process what he meant about pictures, I heard someone shouting, "Tommy!" A man came running through the crowd, panic written all over his face. He was tall, maybe late 30s, with the kind of desperate energy that only comes from a parent who's lost sight of their child in a crowded place. When he reached us, when he saw his son standing next to me, everything changed. The relief on his face shifted to something else entirely. Shock. Recognition. Something that looked almost like terror. He stopped running. He stopped moving altogether. He just stood there staring at me like he'd seen a ghost, and maybe he had. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, in a whisper so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the airport noise, he said, "It can't be." I stood up slowly, still confused, but now genuinely concerned. This stranger was looking at me like he knew me, like seeing me was the most impossible thing in the world. There was something familiar about him, something that made my stomach flutter with recognition I couldn't quite place. "Do I know you?" I asked, because clearly I was missing something important here. His answer hit me like a physical blow, like someone had just knocked all the air out of my lungs. "Sarah Chen, you boarded Flight 611 to Bangkok 10 years ago. The plane crashed into the ocean 3 hours after takeoff. There were no survivors." The airport noise faded to a dull roar. My vision narrowed. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about who I was, about the last 10 years, suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. Because I remembered that flight. I remembered buying that ticket. And I definitely remembered being alive for every single day since then. So how was I supposed to be dead? Let me back up and tell you about the life I thought I knew, the life I'd been living for the past 10 years while apparently being dead. I built my consulting firm from nothing. After college, I spent 3 years working for a soul-crushing corporate marketing department where I learned that my ideas were either stolen by my boss or buried in committee meetings. So I took every penny I'd saved, rented a tiny office space in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, and started Chen Marketing Solutions. It wasn't glamorous. For the first 2 years, I lived on ramen noodles and determination, working 18-hour days to prove that a 25-year-old with more ambition than experience could make it on her own. And I did make it. By 32, I had 12 employees, a client roster that included 3 major Seattle tech companies, and enough success that I could actually afford to live in the city I'd grown to love. My apartment overlooked Elliott Bay, and on clear days, I could see the Olympic Mountains. I had a routine that worked for me. Morning coffee at the same cafe on Pine Street, evening runs along the waterfront, weekend trips to Pike Place Market where I'd buy flowers for my kitchen table, even though no one else would see them. I liked my life. It was predictable, in the best possible way. I knew what to expect each day, and after years of uncertainty and financial stress, that predictability felt like luxury. The Los Angeles trip had been a big deal for me. Nexus Technologies was the kind of client that could change everything for my business. They were developing some kind of revolutionary app for small businesses, and they needed a complete marketing strategy from brand identity to launch campaign, the kind of project that could fund my expansion plans for the next 2 years. I'd spent 3 days in meetings, presentations, and strategy sessions. The Nexus team was young, brilliant, and demanding. They asked tough questions and pushed back on everything, which I actually loved. By the 3rd day, when their CEO shook my hand and said, "We're going to make this work, Sarah," I felt like I was floating. The flight back to Seattle was delayed by 2 hours, which normally would have annoyed me, but I was too excited to care. I used the time to update my business plan, calculating how much I could invest in new hires and better office space. I was thinking about calling my parents to share the good news, maybe even taking them out for dinner at that fancy restaurant my mom had been wanting to try. Walking through LAX, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be in life. 32 years old, successful, independent, with a clear vision for my future. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, but that felt like a choice, rather than something missing. I dated occasionally, but I'd never met anyone who made me want to change my carefully constructed life. I remember thinking, as I waited for my ride, that this was what happiness felt like. Not the explosive kind you see in movies, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands. The terminal was busy, but not overwhelming. I'd traveled enough for business that airports felt familiar rather than stressful. I found a spot near the pickup area where I could see the street and started scrolling through emails on my phone. My assistant had already scheduled 3 new client meetings for the following week. My biggest worry was whether I'd have time to grocery shop before my cupboards were completely bare. That's when I heard the crying. Not the dramatic sobbing of an adult having a breakdown, but the scared, confused crying of a child who doesn't understand why the world suddenly doesn't make sense. I looked up from my phone and saw this little boy standing about 20 feet away, turning in circles like he was looking for something or someone. He was small for what I guessed was 5 or 6 years old, with straight, dark hair that kept falling into his eyes. He wore jeans and a red t-shirt under a denim jacket that was too big for him, and he clutched a Spider-Man backpack like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. His face was scrunched up in that way kids get when they're trying really hard to be brave, but failing. My heart did that thing it always does when I see a child in distress. I've never had kids of my own, but I've always had this protective instinct that kicks in automatically. Maybe it comes from being the oldest of 3 kids, or maybe it's just who I am, but I can't see a scared child without wanting to help. I put my phone away and started walking toward him, planning to ask if he was lost and help him find airport security or his parents. Simple, straightforward, the kind of small kindness that makes you feel good about yourself. I had no idea I was walking toward the moment that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my own existence. The moment I got close enough to speak to the little boy, everything changed in a way I still can't fully explain. He looked up at me with those huge brown eyes, and instead of the wariness most lost children show toward strangers, his face broke into the biggest smile I'd ever seen. Pure joy, like someone had just handed him everything he'd ever wanted for Christmas. "Mommy," he shouted, launching himself at my legs with the complete trust only children possess. "You're here! Daddy said you were coming back." The collision knocked me off balance, both physically and emotionally. I felt his small arms wrap around my thighs, his face pressed against my hip, and this overwhelming wave of protectiveness washed over me. But underneath that was confusion, because this child clearly thought he knew me. I gently placed my hands on his shoulders and crouched down to his eye level, keeping my voice calm and warm. "Hey there, buddy. I think you might have me confused with someone else. I'm not your mommy, sweetheart. Are you lost? What's your name?" He pulled back just enough to look at me, his brow furrowing in that serious way kids get when adults aren't understanding something that seems obvious to them. "I'm Tommy," he said, like that explained everything. "And you're my mommy. I know because Daddy showed me lots of pictures of you and you have the same smile. See?" He pointed at my face with one small finger. The same happy eyes, too. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This child genuinely believed I was his mother, and he was talking about photographs. "Tommy, I think there's been a mistake. I don't have any children. Let's find your daddy and get this sorted out, okay?" But before I could stand up, I heard someone shouting his name across the terminal. "Tommy! Tommy!" The voice was deep, desperate, with the kind of panic that only comes from a parent who's lost their child in a crowded place. I looked up to see a man pushing through the crowd, his head turning frantically as he searched. He was tall, probably around 6 feet, with dark hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested he worked out regularly, but wasn't obsessed about it. He wore dark jeans and a gray button-down shirt, and everything about his body language screamed fear. "There's your daddy," I told Tommy, standing up and waving to get the man's attention. "He's right over there." The man's eyes found us across the crowded space, and I watched relief flood his face as he spotted his son. He started jogging toward us, calling out, "Tommy, you can't just run off like that." I was scared to death. But as he got closer, something strange happened. His jogging slowed to a walk, then to hesitant steps, and finally he stopped completely, about 10 feet away from us. The relief on his face transformed into something else entirely. Shock, disbelief, something that looked almost like terror. He was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Not the grateful look of a parent whose child had been helped by a kind stranger, but something much deeper and more complicated. His face had gone pale, and his mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. "Daddy!" Tommy called out happily, grabbing my hand and trying to pull me toward his father. "Look, Mommy came back just like you said she would." The man's eyes never left my face. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion I couldn't identify. "It can't be." Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. There was recognition in his voice, familiarity, and something that sounded like grief. He knew me. This complete stranger somehow knew me, and seeing me was clearly the last thing he'd expected to happen. I felt my heart rate pick up, that fight-or-flight response kicking in even though I didn't understand why. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do I know you? Your son seems to think I'm his mother, but I think there's been some kind of mistake." The man took a shaky step closer, his eyes scanning my face like he was memorizing every detail. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger but filled with an emotion I couldn't name. "Sarah Chen," he said, and hearing my name from his lips sent a chill down my spine. "You boarded Flight 611 to Bangkok 10 years ago." My breath caught. I remembered that flight. I remembered buying that ticket, remembered the departure gate, remembered standing in line to board, but I also remembered the life I'd lived for the past 10 years, every day of it. "The plane crashed into the Pacific Ocean 3 hours after takeoff," he continued, his voice gaining strength even as his hands trembled slightly. 237 passengers, no survivors. I should know, because I've spent the last 10 years believing you were dead. The airport noise faded to white static. My vision narrowed until all I could see was this man's face, these impossible words hanging in the air between us. Because I definitely remembered that flight, and I definitely remembered being alive every single day since then. For a moment that felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe. The words, Flight 611, echoed in my head, while everything around me seemed to tilt sideways. I could feel Tommy's small hand still gripping mine, could hear the normal sounds of the airport continuing around us, but it all felt like it was happening to someone else. "That's impossible," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "I'm standing right here. I've been alive for the past 10 years. I have a business, an apartment, a life in Seattle. I just closed the biggest deal of my career 3 days ago." The man, who still hadn't told me his name, was studying my face with an intensity that made me want to step back. But something about the pain in his eyes kept me rooted in place. This wasn't the look of someone trying to deceive me. This was the look of someone whose entire world had just been turned upside down. "I know this sounds crazy," he said, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "But I was supposed to be on that flight with you. We were supposed to travel together. I had to cancel at the last minute because of a work emergency, and you decided to go alone. We had a fight about it. Oh, you said I always put work first, and maybe you were right." Fragments of memory started flickering at the edges of my consciousness. A face that looked younger, but unmistakably his. An argument in an airport coffee shop. The feeling of being disappointed but not surprised. But the memories felt distant, like watching someone else's home movies. "I need to sit down," I said, because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Daddy, why does Mommy look scared?" Tommy asked, his voice small and confused. "Did I do something wrong?" The man, who I was starting to realize might actually be someone from my past, knelt down and pulled his son close. "You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated things to figure out. Can you be patient while Mommy and I talk?" The way he said Mommy when referring to me sent another wave of disorientation through my system. But what struck me even more was how naturally Tommy accepted the explanation, how he seemed completely comfortable with the idea that I belonged in their family. "We need to go somewhere private," I said, making the first real decision since this surreal encounter began. "Away from all these people. I need answers, and your son doesn't need to hear whatever conversation we're about to have." He nodded immediately. "There's a quiet restaurant upstairs in Terminal 7. We can talk there." As we walked through the airport, Tommy chattering happily between us about his upcoming first-grade class and his new teacher, Mrs. Patterson, I found myself studying the man beside me. There was something achingly familiar about the way he moved, the way he absently ruffled his son's hair, the way he kept glancing at me like he was afraid I might disappear. "What's your name?" I asked as we found a table in the back corner of a nearly empty restaurant. "David Rodriguez," he said, and the name hit me like a physical punch. David. I knew that name. I knew that face. But the knowledge felt buried under layers of fog, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. "Can I see your phone?" I asked, surprising myself with how direct I sounded. "If you have pictures of us together, I want to see them." David hesitated for just a moment, then handed over his phone. "I should warn you, these are going to be hard to look at for both of us." I scrolled through his photo album, and there I was, younger, with longer hair and a different style, but unmistakably me. Pictures of us at restaurants, at the beach, at what looked like a family barbecue. In every photo, I looked happy in a way I couldn't remember feeling. There was one picture in particular that made my chest tight. Me wearing a simple diamond ring, laughing at something off camera while David looked at me with complete adoration. "We were engaged," he said quietly, watching my face as I stared at the photo. "You said yes 6 months before the trip. We were going to get married when you got back from Bangkok." "Why don't I remember this clearly?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I remember fragments, pieces, but it's like looking at someone else's life." "I don't know," David said, "but I need to understand what happened, how you survived when everyone else died, where you've been for 10 years, how you built a whole new life." I looked at Tommy, who was drawing on a napkin with a crayon the waitress had given him, completely oblivious to the fact that his world might be about to change as dramatically as mine already had. "I need to research this flight," I said, pulling out my own phone. "I need to see the passenger manifest, the crash reports, everything. Because either I'm losing my mind or something impossible happened 10 years ago." "We'll figure it out together," David said. And something about the way he said it made me believe him. For the first time since Tommy had called me Mommy, I felt like I could breathe again. David pulled out his laptop while I used my phone to search for information about Flight 611. Tommy had fallen asleep in the booth next to his father, his small head resting on David's arm, completely peaceful while the two adults in his life tried to solve an impossible puzzle. The first search result made my stomach drop. Pacific Airways Flight 611 crashes en route to Bangkok. 237 dead, no survivors. The headline was from the Seattle Times, dated exactly 10 years and 3 months ago. I clicked on the article with trembling fingers. The details were horrifying. The plane had encountered severe turbulence 3 hours into the flight and lost contact with air traffic control. Wreckage was found scattered across a 50-mile radius in the Pacific Ocean. The investigation concluded that a catastrophic structural failure had caused the aircraft to break apart mid-flight. No bodies were ever recovered due to the depth of the ocean and the condition of the wreckage. "Look at this," I whispered, showing David my screen. "They have a complete passenger manifest." We scrolled down together, and there it was. Row 27, Seat A, Sarah Chen. My name, my passport number, my emergency contact information. According to this official record, I had died 10 years ago along with 236 other people. "This doesn't make sense," I said, my voice shaking. "I remember buying this ticket. I remember going to the airport that day. But I also remember the last 10 years of my life. Every day, every decision, every moment that led me to where I am now." David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the screen. Then he started typing on his laptop. "I kept everything from that time," he said. "Articles, investigation reports, even your boarding pass stub that I found in your apartment when I was packing up your things." "You packed up my apartment?" "Your parents asked me to. They were too devastated to do it themselves." He paused in his typing and looked at me. "Sarah, your funeral had over 200 people. Your parents never got over losing you. Your mother still calls me every year on the anniversary." The weight of this revelation hit me like a physical blow. My parents thought I was dead. They had grieved for me, buried an empty coffin, spent 10 years mourning a daughter who was actually alive, and building a successful business 3 states away. "I need to call them," I said, reaching for my phone. "Wait," David said, catching my wrist gently. "Look at this first." He had pulled up what looked like an internal airline document, some kind of last-minute passenger change log. "I got this from a friend who worked for Pacific Airways back then. Look at the entry for your seat." The screen showed a notation. "Passenger change, 1645, S. Chen ticket transferred to E. Vasquez. Medical emergency documentation provided." I stared at the screen, and suddenly a memory surfaced with crystal clarity. The airport 10 years ago. A young woman, maybe 22 or 23, crying at the gate. She'd been speaking rapid Spanish into her phone, and I had caught enough to understand that her mother was dying in a hospital in Bangkok. "Elena Vasquez," I whispered. "Oh my God, I remember her." The memory came flooding back like a dam bursting. I had been having second thoughts about the trip, about running away from my problems with David, about leaving my life behind to teach English in Thailand. I was standing in line to board when I heard this young woman pleading with the gate agent, explaining that she had been trying to get home to see her dying mother but couldn't afford a ticket. "I gave her my ticket," I said, the words tumbling out as the memory became clearer. "She was so desperate, and I was having doubts about the whole trip anyway. I thought it was a sign. I gave her my boarding pass and my passport, told her to use my name. The gate agent didn't look too closely at the photo because we had similar coloring." David stared at me in amazement. "You gave away your seat to a stranger?" "She said her mother was dying. She'd been trying to get home for weeks but couldn't afford the flight. I had bought my ticket impulsively after our fight, and standing there, watching her cry, it felt like the universe was telling me something." I paused, the full weight of what had happened settling over me. "Elena Vasquez died using my identity. She died trying to get home to her mother. And you walked away from the airport and started over?" "Not exactly." More memories were surfacing now. After I gave her the ticket, I felt lost. I had quit my job, given up my apartment lease, told everyone I was leaving. I felt like I couldn't go back to my old life, but I also couldn't go forward with the new one. I spent that night in an airport hotel, and by morning I had decided to disappear completely, start fresh somewhere else. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "You could have called me. You could have told me what happened." "I was angry at you," I admitted. "And I was young and stupid, and thought dramatic gestures were the same thing as real solutions. I moved to Seattle, got a fake ID, built a new life from scratch. While I spent 10 years believing you were dead. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt the full weight of what my decision had cost him, cost my parents, cost everyone who had loved me. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears finally starting to fall. "I had no idea what I was putting you through." The silence that followed my apology stretched between us like a chasm filled with 10 years of grief, missed opportunities, and the weight of choices that had changed everything. David was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, while Tommy slept peacefully against his father's shoulder, unaware that the woman he had mistaken for his mother had just confessed to accidentally faking her own death. "I need to call my parents," I said finally, my voice barely steady. "They need to know I'm alive." David nodded slowly. "They moved to Arizona 5 years ago. Your mother said Seattle had too many memories. She couldn't walk past the coffee shop where you used to meet her for lunch without breaking down." Each detail hit me like a physical blow. My mother's favorite coffee shop, our monthly lunch dates, the life I had abandoned without considering the collateral damage. "What about my sister?" "My brother." "Amy lives in Portland now. She named her daughter Sarah after you. And Michael, he became a grief counselor. He said losing you made him want to help other families cope with sudden loss." I had to put my head in my hands. My siblings had restructured their entire lives around my death. Amy had honored my memory by naming her child after me. Michael had chosen a career path motivated by the trauma of losing his sister. The ripple effects of my thoughtless decision had shaped a decade of other people's lives. "I destroyed so many people," I whispered. "You made a choice," David said, his voice gentler than I deserved. "A young, impulsive choice that saved Elena's life and cost us all 10 years of grief. But Sarah, you also built something beautiful. You have a successful business. You've helped other companies grow. You've created jobs for people. That matters too." I looked up at him, surprised by the absence of anger in his voice. "How are you not furious with me?" David shifted Tommy gently and looked at me with eyes that held more sadness than anger. "I was furious for years. I was angry at you for leaving, angry at myself for not being on that plane, angry at God for taking you away from me. But eventually I realized that anger was just another way of avoiding the grief. And now, sitting here looking at you, I realize that I'm not the same person who loved you 10 years ago, and you're not the same person who loved me back." He was right. The woman in those photographs, laughing and carefree and wearing his engagement ring, felt like a stranger to me. The man sitting across from me was older, weathered by loss and responsibility, shaped by experiences I hadn't shared. "Tell me about Tommy's mother," I said, because I needed to understand the life David had built in my absence. "Maria," he said, his voice soft with memory. "I met her 4 years after the crash. She was a teacher, kind and patient and nothing like you, which is probably why I was able to love her. She never tried to replace what we had. She just offered something different." He paused, looking down at his sleeping son. "She died in a car accident when Tommy was 4. Drunk driver ran a red light." The weight of his losses, the idea that he had loved and lost again, made my chest tight with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, David." "Tommy barely remembers her," he continued. "But I kept pictures of you too. Told him stories about the woman I had loved before his mom. He's been asking about you his whole life, wondering if you might come back someday. Today, when he saw you, it was like his prayers had been answered." I looked at Tommy, this sweet boy who had unknowingly orchestrated this reunion, and felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with uncertainty. "What happens now?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm not the same man who was going to marry you, and you're not the same woman who is going to marry me. But Tommy sees you as part of his family, and maybe we owe it to him to figure out what that means." "I need to go back to Seattle," I said. "I have a business to run, employees depending on me, but I also need to call my parents, my siblings. I need to figure out how to come back from the dead without destroying the life I've built. And I need to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes the people we love come back, but not in the way we expected." We sat there for another hour, making plans and exchanging contact information. Two people trying to bridge a decade of separation and loss. When Tommy woke up, he smiled at me like my presence was the most natural thing in the world. And I realized that maybe second chances don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Sometimes they look like airport terminals and mistaken identity, and small boys who see love where adults see only complications. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make and the lives we touch, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell me about a time when a small decision changed everything for you. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about love and loss and the unexpected ways our lives intersect, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places.